Nobody ever expects the monster to be someone who kisses your forehead goodnight, or the boy who makes you laugh with silly faces during Sunday lunch. But sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed. They're the ones sitting at the breakfast table with you, eating toast with butter, calling the same man Dad. Good afternoon, dear hearts. My name is Simone, but most people now call me Grandma Simone. I'm 73 years old and speaking to you today from my little house in Riverside, California. It's a small place, with peeling paint on the porch rails and flower pots that bloom just the way I like them. Nothing too fancy, but it holds stories. Many stories. Some light, some dark, and one in particular that I've carried in silence for most of my life. If this story finds its way to your heart, I hope you'll let me know. Tell me where you're watching from. Maybe how many brothers or sisters you have. I love reading those comments. They remind me how beautifully different, yet deeply connected we all are. I was born in 1952, in a time when children were to be seen, not heard. My mother used to say that often not out of cruelty but exhaustion. She was a seamstress, working long hours at the clothing factory downtown, bent over a Singer machine day after day, with tired eyes and fingers that never stopped moving. My father worked in a steel mill. He left before the sun rose and came home after it had already disappeared. His hands were always rough, his words few, and his body worn from decades of labor. We were 3 siblings. Maristella, my older sister by 4 years. Augusto, we called him Osto, 2 years older than me. And then there was me. The youngest. The quietest. The watcher. Our house was nothing special. A small yellow brick home in a working-class neighborhood where the air always smelled faintly of oil and metal, where everyone's windows rattled when the factory whistle blew. We didn't have much, but we weren't starving either. We had rice and beans, sometimes a little meat if the paycheck stretched far enough. We had a backyard where Mama grew mint and basil, and kept 3 scraggly hens that gave us eggs too small to ever satisfy, but just big enough to call breakfast. Maristella. She was my star like her name promised. At 12 she was already more mother than child. She woke early to pack our school lunches, ironed our uniforms with hands too small for such grown-up tasks, and kissed my forehead when I had nightmares. She was the one who told me again and again, "Stay close to me, Moan. I won't let anyone hurt you." And for many years she kept that promise. With her around I felt like the world couldn't reach me. Osto, though, he was different. He had a quiet rage. The kind you can't see unless you're really looking. At school he got into fights. At home he slammed doors, rolled his eyes, and muttered things under his breath. "Little Miss Perfect," he'd say when Maristella tried to get him to help around the house. When no one was watching he'd pinch me hard. Not because he hated me, I don't think, but because it made her angry. Because it gave him control. My parents were too tired to notice. My father would just grunt and say, "The boy needs discipline." And Mama, she would sigh and say it was just a phase. Hormones, she called it. Boys becoming men. But Maristella knew better. She saw what others missed. She saw how Osto looked at girls on the street. Too long, too hungrily. She saw the gestures he made when he thought no one was watching. She saw the danger growing slowly, quietly inside our own home. I was 11 when she pulled me into a corner of the kitchen one day. Her voice low, her eyes serious. "If he ever touches you," she said, "you tell me. No matter what he says. No matter how scared you are." I didn't really understand what she meant then. But I remembered. Her face, her voice, her fear. They etched themselves into me. We shared a tiny bedroom, Maristella and I. Twin beds pushed so close they may as well have been one. She smelled like ivory soap and basil from Mama's garden. At night we'd whisper about dreams. She wanted to open a flower shop. I wanted to be a teacher. "One day," she promised, "we'll have our own place. You'll study. I'll work. And we'll be free." I believed her. I believed in her. And then one spring afternoon everything changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to tell you everything from the beginning. Not because it's easy, God knows it's not, but because I believe stories like mine are too important to keep buried. So if you're still with me, make yourself a warm cup of tea, sit somewhere quiet, and let me share with you what happened next. Because sometimes the truth is ugly. Sometimes it hurts. But telling it, finally telling it, is how we begin to heal. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there needs to hear this today. If I close my eyes today, 73 years later, I can still feel the warmth of her breath on my cheek as she whispered, "Don't worry, Moan, I'm here." Only she called me that, Moan. A sweet, silly nickname she invented when I couldn't pronounce my own name as a toddler. And she never let it go. To everyone else I was Simone. To her I was something smaller, softer. Someone worth protecting. Her name was Maristella. Star of the sea, Mama said. And in the choppy, unforgiving waters of our childhood, she truly was my North Star. Maristella wasn't loud. She wasn't the kind of girl who demanded attention. But she held it. In every room she entered, people sat up straighter. Not because she was beautiful, though she was in a quiet sort of way, but because she carried herself like someone who knew the weight of things. Even at 12, she had the soul of a woman twice her age. While most girls her age played hopscotch or flirted with boys at the corner store, Maristella was ironing Papa's shirts, boiling beans in Mama's dented pot, brushing knots out of my hair while humming lullabies. She didn't complain. She didn't roll her eyes like other big sisters did. She just did. Always. For everyone. I remember one particular Thursday evening. Mama was late coming home from the factory. Papa hadn't returned yet either. The power had gone out, and I was terrified of the dark. I was crying, curled up in the corner of our tiny bedroom. Maristella didn't panic. She lit a candle, sat beside me, and started telling me a story about two sisters who lived in a castle made of books. One could talk to flowers, she said, and the other could speak the truth no one else dared say. That was her way. Using stories to soothe the storms inside me. I fell asleep in her lap that night, the candle flickering between our shadows. She was my mother when Mama couldn't be. My defender when no one else noticed. My truth teller when I didn't even know I was lying to myself. But perhaps what made Maristella most remarkable wasn't just her love. It was her watchfulness. You see, she saw Osto before anyone else did. Back then, people didn't talk about boys being dangerous. If a boy was aggressive, they said he was spirited. If he cursed, he's just blowing off steam. When girls felt uncomfortable, the advice was simple. Ignore it. Be polite. Don't provoke. But Maristella knew better. She noticed how Osto's teasing turned into cruelty. How his eyes lingered too long on the girls who walked past our front gate. How his jokes got uglier, darker. She didn't have a degree in psychology. She didn't need one. She had instinct. And more importantly, she had courage. One afternoon, after Osto had pinched me hard when no one was looking, I ran to her in tears. She didn't go to Mama. She didn't cry. She took my face in her hands and said, "From now on, you don't stay alone with him. Ever. If I'm not around, you go outside. To the neighbor. To the corner shop. Anywhere. Do you hear me?" I nodded, my little chest heaving. "I'm serious, Moan. He's wrong. He's getting worse." Looking back, I know now what she meant. She saw the signs. She was preparing me for something she prayed would never happen. She even gave up her dreams to protect me. Maristella had been invited to join the youth choir at church, the one that traveled to other towns to sing. It was her escape, her joy. But she declined. "Too much to do at home," she said. "Who'll watch over Moan while I'm gone?" I never realized what she sacrificed for me until much later. There's a photograph I keep, creased and faded, from a Sunday afternoon in 1967. We're sitting under the plum tree in our backyard. I'm about 10, she's 14. I'm holding a book upside down, pretending to read. She's looking at me with this little smile. Not laughing, not mocking. Just proud. It's the last picture I have of her smiling like that. The year after, everything changed. Because you see, dear hearts, no matter how brave, no matter how vigilant, sometimes even stars get pulled into the tide. She was 20 when she died. Hit by a car that ran a red light. 3 others gone in an instant. Just like that. I was 16. And in that moment, the last shield I had in the world shattered. We held her funeral on a Tuesday. No choir sang. No long speeches. Just some neighbors, co-workers, and a casket that looked too small to contain a life so large. I remember standing at the edge of that grave, watching the dirt fall like time itself. My hands clenched. My heart not broken, ripped. Because I knew. Without her, the nightmare would begin. And it did. But that, my dear listener, is what I'll tell you in the next part of my story. Because what comes next is the beginning of the darkest chapter of my life. But before we go there, I want you to remember her name. Maristella. The girl who gave everything to keep her sister safe. The girl who saw the monster before it showed its teeth. The girl who, even in death, continues to protect me because without her, I wouldn't be here to speak at all. I think every family has a moment when time seems to fracture. When something happens, not loud like thunder, but quiet, like the snapping of a thin thread, and nothing is ever quite the same afterward. For us, it was Maristella's funeral. It was a Tuesday. The sky was overcast as if the sun itself couldn't bear to shine. Our little backyard was eerily still that morning. No breeze. No birds. Even the chickens stayed silent. The funeral itself was simple. Some co-workers from the fabric store came. A few neighbors. My mother brought wilted flowers from the kitchen table, and I remember clinging to the hem of her dress the way I used to when I was 5. But I wasn't 5 anymore. I was 16. And I had just lost the one person who had always made the world feel safe. But what I remember most from that day wasn't the priest's prayer or the smell of wet earth. It was Osto's face. He didn't cry. He didn't even pretend to. While my mother collapsed into my father's arms, shaking with a grief that seemed to tear her apart, and while I stood beside her, too numb to cry, Osto just watched. His hands were in his pockets. His eyes didn't blink. And on the corners of his mouth, barely there but unmistakable, was a smile. Not a big toothy grin. No. This was something darker. A curl of the lip. A flicker of something almost satisfied. And in that moment I felt something inside me shift. Like someone had dropped a stone into still water, and I would spend the rest of my life feeling the ripples. At first I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe grief had distorted my vision. But as the days passed, I started to notice other things, small things that I had once brushed off. The way Osto now sat in Maristella's chair at the dinner table uninvited. The way he walked through the house slower like he was claiming it. The way his eyes stayed on me too long when I washed dishes or swept the floor or brushed my hair in front of the hallway mirror. He was bolder now. Less cautious. And something in me, some small still voice, started to whisper. She was the only thing that kept him away. And now she's gone. Grief is supposed to bring people together. That's what everyone says. But in our house it created more silence. More distance. My parents retreated into their own worlds, Mama into work, Papa into long hours and longer silences. And I was left alone. With him. It started with small things. He'd pass too close behind me in the hallway, brushing my shoulder. He'd make comments, vague enough to sound harmless but sharp enough to cut. Maristella always liked things tidy. You should try harder, Simone. Or, getting older now, huh? Almost a woman. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what I was feeling. Fear, yes, but also confusion, shame, anger. And something else I couldn't name. Something like betrayal. And then I remembered that smile. That moment at the funeral when the rest of us fell apart, and he stood still, almost pleased. I realized then what Maristella must have known for a long time. He didn't just hate her. He wanted her gone. Whether he'd ever say it out loud or admit it even to himself, that smile was his confession. His release. His freedom. And I was the one left behind. There's a term psychologists use, boundary testing. It's what abusers do before they act. They test the waters. See how much they can get away with. A touch here. A comment there. If you flinch, they back off for a while. If you say nothing, they take one more step. And just like that, bit by bit, they tighten the noose. I didn't understand that then. I only knew that I felt dirty in my own home. That I no longer felt safe in my own skin. That every creak of the hallway floorboards at night made my heart race. That every moment without Maristella felt like a slow unraveling of everything I believed was true. Looking back, I wish someone had told me, what you're feeling is real. What you're sensing is valid. You don't need proof to trust your instincts. Because one of the cruelest tricks that monsters like Osto play is convincing you that you're the crazy one. That you're imagining it. Overreacting. Being too sensitive. And so you begin to doubt your own mind. But let me say this for anyone out there listening. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if someone makes you feel small, scared, ashamed without touching you, that is a kind of touch. And it is violence. I didn't know that at 16. I only knew that the boy who once shared my cereal bowl was now my biggest fear. And the house where I'd once felt safest was now a labyrinth of shadows and closed doors. What I also didn't know was that things were about to get much worse. Because boundary testing only stops when someone stops it. And I was a 16-year-old girl with no voice left, no shield, and no one to hear me. But all of that, the day the boundaries shattered, the night that changed everything, is what I'll tell you in the next part of my story. They say monsters roar before they strike. But in real life, monsters don't growl. They whisper. They smile. They knock softly on your door and call you sweetheart. That's how it begins. When people hear the word abuse, they often think of bruises, yelling, slammed doors, broken bones. But what I learned, too young and too painfully, is that the most dangerous form of abuse doesn't start with violence. It starts with a look, a comment, a soft kind of invasion so subtle you can't even name it. That's grooming. And Osto was a master at it. After Maristella died, things didn't change all at once. If they had, I might have seen it coming. Might have told someone. But grooming doesn't work like that. It's a slow boil. I remember the first time I noticed the way his eyes changed. I was doing dishes in the tiny kitchen, the window open to let in the warm spring air. My hands were deep in soapy water. He walked behind me, not touching me, not saying a word. But I felt it. His gaze. It lingered, not like a brother, not like family, but like someone who had begun to see me differently. And not in a way that made me feel seen but watched. I told myself I was imagining it. That night he asked, "You're looking more like a woman lately." I laughed nervously. "Stop it," I said. "That's weird." He smiled. "Just saying. You're not a kid anymore." It didn't sound threatening. Just a comment. But it stuck in my skin like a splinter. That's the thing with grooming. The abuser tests you. They push a little, then watch your reaction. If you speak up, they back off for a while. If you stay quiet, they push further. Soon came the casual touches. Passing me in the hallway, his hand would brush my back, just a second too long. Or he'd squeeze my shoulder while reaching for a cup in the cupboard. "Relax, Moan," he'd say with a smirk. "You're so jumpy these days." And I started to wonder, was I overreacting? Was I imagining this? That's how grooming works. It makes you question your own reality. I stopped inviting friends over. I started locking the bathroom door, even though the lock barely worked. I found excuses to stay late at school. Sometimes I'd pretend I had tutoring or group work. I'd sit in the library for hours, not reading, just avoiding home. But no one noticed. My parents were drowning in grief and bills. They saw me losing weight, getting quieter, skipping meals, and they thought it was sadness. "She misses Maristella," they said. "She'll bounce back." But I wasn't bouncing. I was shrinking, disappearing. And Osto? He knew. He knew no one would stop him. He knew our house was a fortress of silence. One night, I was watching TV in the living room, trying to stay awake until my parents got home. Osto came in, flopped on the couch next to me. Too close. "You smell like strawberries," he said. I froze. He reached for my hair and brushed it behind my ear, so gently, like he was being sweet. "I'm your brother," he whispered. "You can trust me." That was the night I started sleeping with the chair pushed against the bedroom door. There's something cruel about grooming because it steals your voice before the abuse even begins. It makes you feel complicit in your own harm. And that shame, it's like a rope that tightens every day. I didn't know what was happening to me. I just knew I felt smaller and smaller each time he walked into a room. Now, years later, I can name it. Grooming. It's the prelude to every nightmare no one wants to talk about. It's why so many girls and boys don't speak up. Because when the abuse finally comes, they think, "But I didn't say no before. But I didn't run away when he touched me the first time. But I let him hug me. Maybe it's my fault." Let me tell you something from one survivor to another. It's not. No one consents to being groomed. No one chooses to be made small, afraid, confused in their own home. Grooming is not affection. It is not love. It is a strategy, a manipulation, a trap. And it works because it hides in plain sight. At 16, I didn't know the language to fight it. I only knew that I was walking through my own house like a guest in a stranger's home, flinching at footsteps, dreading every shared silence. And then came the day that would shatter even the illusion of safety. The day the testing ended. And the taking began. What happened next is the part one never thought I'd share. But I will. Because silence is how monsters survive. And I am done being silent. There are nights so sharp, so final, they don't fade with time. They don't soften. They live on inside you, etched in bone and breath. For me, that night came when I was just 16. It was a Friday. I remember the smell of beans on the stove, the ticking of the old kitchen clock, The slow drip of a faucet Mama always said she'd fix but never did. Normal things. Safe things. And then the knock. Not on the door. On my bedroom window. 3 soft taps. Not urgent. Not angry. Intentional. I froze. I'd just finished brushing my hair, trying to distract myself from the gnawing fear that had become part of my daily routine. I knew those taps. Osto had used them before when sneaking out at night. But this time, they were for me. I tiptoed to the window. He stood there, cigarette in hand, grinning like a boy with a secret. "Come outside," he whispered. "Need your help with something." My first instinct was to say no. To pretend I was asleep. To run and lock the bathroom door and never come out. But we were taught not to cause trouble. Not to say no to family. So I nodded. Quietly slipped on my shoes. Walked out into the dark. He led me behind the house, past the shed, into the alley where the streetlight flickered. There was a car waiting, an old, gray Buick. The kind that smelled like ash and secrets. 2 men sat inside. Middle-aged. One in a suit that didn't fit. The other with hands that looked too soft to work. I didn't understand at first. "Get in," Osto said, motioning toward the back seat. My legs froze. "Why?" I asked. "They just want to talk. You'll be back in 10 minutes. That's how it always starts. 10 minutes. I shook my head. No. That was when he grabbed my arm. Not hard. Not violently. But enough to let me know it wasn't a question. "Don't be stupid," he hissed. "They paid. You'll be fine." They paid. Those 2 words cracked something open in me. I wasn't his sister in that moment. I wasn't even a person. I was currency. I don't remember the ride. Not really. My mind folded in on itself. I remember the smell of cologne. The fake leather seats. The sound of one man clearing his throat. I remember how the house we arrived at had thick curtains and no porch light. And I remember what happened after. Not in full color. More like pieces, flashes of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I won't tell you everything. Some wounds don't need reopening. But here's what I will say. That night, my body stopped feeling like mine. That night, my voice disappeared. That night, something inside me went quiet. Like a light that knew it was safer to stay off. They dropped me home 2 hours later. I walked inside on shaking legs. No one noticed. Mama was asleep. Papa snored in the armchair. And Osto? He was in the kitchen, eating a sandwich. He didn't even look up. I went straight to my room and sat on the floor for hours, staring at the crack under the door. My clothes smelled like sweat and cheap aftershave. I didn't cry. Not that night. I washed my hands 3 times. Then 5. Then 7. But nothing came off. The next morning he handed me $10. "Told you they'd pay well," he said. "Maybe next time you won't act so high and mighty." Next time. That was when I realized this wasn't a one-time horror. This was the beginning of something worse. I wasn't just broken. I was branded. To him, to them, to the silence that surrounded me. And yet I said nothing. Because who would believe me? A 16-year-old girl. Grieving. Withdrawn. Barely speaking. Claiming her brother, her own flesh and blood, had sold her? The shame sat heavier than the pain. But here's what I want to tell you, dear listener, if you've ever felt that kind of silence choking you. The shame is not yours. The guilt is not yours. The blame does not belong to you. It took me decades to say that without flinching. But I'll say it now as loudly as I can. I was not at fault. And neither are you. What Osto did wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. And that night, beneath that flickering streetlight, in the back seat of that car, he crossed a line that would shape the rest of my life. He didn't just steal my safety. He sold it. He didn't just hurt me. He opened the door to men who didn't even know my name but knew my worth in dollars. And I survived. Because sometimes survival is all you can do. But survival is not the end. Because what came next? The spiral, the silence, the unthinkable repetition of that first night. That's the part of my story that still makes my hands shake when I write. But I will tell it. Because the truth has been quiet long enough. There's a moment after every storm where silence settles like dust. People think it's peace. But sometimes it's just the beginning of the next storm. After that first night, the one where Osto sold me, I stopped counting time in days. I started counting in shadows. How long I could stay out of the house before the sun went down. How long I could keep my door wedged shut with a chair before it gave way. How long it took for him to come knocking again. The next time was a week later. Same car. Different man. And then it kept happening. Once a week. Then twice. Then more. My body stopped feeling like a body. It became a transaction. A hallway other people walked through, never asking who lived there. By the time I turned 17, my period stopped. I told myself it was stress, starvation, lack of sleep. But deep down I knew. I was pregnant. I remember sitting on the cold floor of the high school bathroom, clutching my knees, wondering what would happen if I just disappeared. But disappearing isn't that simple when you're 16 and broke and trapped under your own roof. I didn't go to a doctor. There was no money, no trust, and no one to tell. And then one morning I woke up in a puddle of blood. No warning. Just pain. And loss. I told my mother I had food poisoning. She handed me tea and aspirin. That was the first goodbye. It didn't stop there. Over the next 4 years it happened 9 more times. 10 pregnancies. 10 losses. Each one silent. Hidden. Packed away like dirty laundry no one wants to acknowledge. Some ended in the middle of the night. Others in bathrooms. Once on the kitchen floor while everyone else slept. No one ever knew. Or maybe they chose not to know. Because silence was safer. In trauma theory, there's something called repetition compulsion, the idea that people who experience deep trauma unconsciously reenact it. Over and over. Not because they want to suffer, but because they're trying to gain control over something that once left them powerless. That was me. Each time I bled, I thought, maybe this one will be different. Maybe this time someone will notice. But no one did. Osto kept selling. I kept surviving. And my body kept breaking. What people don't talk about is how grief piles up in layers. When you lose one child, even one you didn't get to name or hold or kiss goodnight, it leaves a crack. When you lose 10, it builds a canyon inside you. I began to numb myself. I stopped flinching when strange men reached for me. Stopped crying when the blood came. Stopped caring if my hair fell out, if my eyes looked empty, if I failed every class. Because I was no longer a girl. I was a ghost walking through a world that didn't want to see me. And yet, there was still a whisper in me that wanted more. I don't know where it came from. Maybe from Maristella. Maybe from the books I still hid under my mattress and read late at night when everyone was asleep. But somewhere in the deepest part of me was a voice that kept saying, "You're not done. You're not gone. Not yet." That whisper saved me. Because one day it pushed me to walk into the county clinic. Alone. Terrified. I told the nurse I'd missed several periods. She looked at my chart, barely filled in, and asked how old I was. 18, I whispered. She didn't ask why I hadn't come sooner. She didn't lecture me. She just held my hand while the test confirmed what I already knew. And then she asked gently, "Do you feel safe at home?" It was the first time anyone asked me that. And I didn't know how to answer. Because safety wasn't something I could even imagine anymore. I'd lived so long in fear, I didn't know what the opposite felt like. But something cracked open in that clinic room. A small fracture in the wall I'd built around myself. She gave me a pamphlet. A card. A phone number. I didn't call that day. But I kept the card. Slipped it under my pillow. And every night after I'd reach for it. Just to make sure it was still there. Just to remind myself that somewhere out there help existed. Somewhere I wasn't alone. And that tiny thought, that flicker of hope, was the first step on the path to reclaiming my life. But before I could walk it, I had to survive one more betrayal. The kind that doesn't come from strangers or even abusers. The kind that comes from someone who's supposed to love you. My own mother. And that is the part of the story I'll tell you next. If someone had asked me back then who my protector was supposed to be, I would have whispered only one name. Mama. Irene. She wasn't a loud woman. She didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't ever raise a hand against us. But she was strong in her own quiet way. The kind of woman who could turn scraps into soup and silence into routine. She worked long hours at the factory, fingers swollen, back aching, eyes red from sewing under flickering lights. I knew she loved me. At least I believed she did. But real love requires more than food on the table and clean laundry. It requires seeing. And she refused to see. After Maristella died, Mama fell into herself. She started moving like a ghost, automatic and unreachable. She'd stare at the radio in the evenings, barely noticing whether I ate or not. She'd mumble, "Go to bed," without checking if I actually did. And I tried. I tried to tell her. Little things at first. "Mama, can I sleep in your room tonight?" She'd sigh. "You're too old for that now, Simone." You have your own bed. Then bigger hints. Mama, I don't feel safe. She'd pause, glance up from her mending, then say, we're all grieving, honey. You need to be strong. I told her I was bleeding one night. More than usual. She handed me a pad and said, it's just your cycle changing. Happens with stress. But it wasn't stress. And I wasn't strong. I was breaking right in front of her. And she looked away. You see, complicity doesn't always wear the face of malice. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it smells like lavender soap and rice pudding. Sometimes it's a mother who doesn't ask the questions she already fears the answers to. I think, deep down, she knew. She saw the way Osto looked at me. Heard the whispers when he passed my room at night. Noticed the way I flinched when he entered the kitchen. But knowing means acting. And for her, action meant risk. Shame. Disruption of the fragile balance she'd worked her whole life to keep. So she chose silence. And silence, when chosen in the face of a child's suffering, becomes betrayal. The most dangerous kind. Because it comes from the person you still run to in your dreams. I remember the night I finally broke. I had just miscarried, again, and collapsed in the hallway. She found me there, curled on the floor, blood soaking my pajamas. I looked up at her, tears streaming, and whispered, Mama, help me. She didn't scream. Didn't cry. She helped me into bed, cleaned me up in silence, brought me tea. But she didn't ask what happened. Didn't ask who did this to you. She just said, don't tell your father. It'll kill him. That was the moment I realized I wasn't protecting myself by staying quiet. I was being protected from. I became the family secret. The invisible stain they didn't want to scrub, just hide under the rug. Mama wasn't cruel. She wasn't evil. She was terrified. And sometimes fear makes people into cowards. But the child inside me didn't know that. All she knew was that her mother saw her pain and turned away. Years later in therapy, I would learn the word for it: bystander betrayal. It's when the people you depend on to protect you instead become part of the harm, not by action, but by inaction. By allowing abuse to grow in the cracks of their silence. And it hurts. It hurts more than a slap. More than a locked door. Because it means you are alone. But here's the thing. As I got older, I began to understand something else too. Mama was a survivor of her own kind of war. She grew up in a house where women didn't speak unless spoken to. Where her own mother cried in the kitchen at night and no one asked why. Where pain was private and silence was survival. That doesn't excuse what she did. But it explains it. And sometimes understanding is the first step toward healing. One night, years later, after everything, I asked her, why didn't you protect me? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, because I didn't know how. And in her eyes, for the first time, I saw not denial, but shame. And maybe, just maybe, love. It wasn't the answer I wanted. But it was the truth. And truth, no matter how late it arrives, is still better than silence. I carried that moment with me when I finally found someone who did protect me. Someone unexpected. Someone gentle. And her name was Jeanette. Sometimes the people who save us don't arrive with sirens or speeches. They don't crash through walls or shout our names across crowded rooms. Sometimes they come with a warm sweater and a bag of oranges. Sometimes they knock once. Then wait. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. For me, that someone was Jeanette. She wasn't a social worker or therapist. She wasn't trained in trauma or crisis intervention. She was the lady from next door. Middle-aged. Neatly dressed. Hair always in a tight bun. She worked at the town library during the day and tended her roses in the evening. To most people, she was just a quiet neighbor. To me, she became the first human anchor in years. It started with small things. She'd wave when I passed her front yard, even when I didn't wave back. She'd leave a small bag of fruit on our porch, always without a note. Once after a storm, she showed up with a spare umbrella, handed it to me, and said gently, in case yours broke. I didn't trust her, not at first. By then I didn't trust anyone. But Jeanette never pushed. She simply stayed. One afternoon, I was sitting on the steps of our porch, knees hugged to my chest, face blank from another night I couldn't talk about. She walked over slowly, careful not to startle me, and asked, "Do you like books?" I blinked. Books? I hadn't read anything for months. I used to love them, back when I was still me. But now words felt heavy. Stories felt dishonest. Who would write about someone like me? I said, barely audible. She nodded, and the next day a small stack appeared on the porch. Used books. Quiet stories. Women who endured. Women who survived. That was her way in. We never talked about it. She never asked what the shadows under my eyes meant or why I wore long sleeves in the heat. She didn't pry. She saw me and didn't demand anything in return. Over time, I started visiting her garden. She'd be there trimming roses and I'd sit on the stone bench nearby silent. Sometimes she'd talk about the plants. Roses need care, she said once, but too much watering makes them rot. You have to know when to leave them be. I wondered if she meant me. One afternoon, I finally asked, "Why are you so kind to me?" She looked up from her pruning and said, "Because someone once was kind to me. And it saved my life." That was all. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. That single sentence settled into my heart like warm tea on a cold day. It reminded me that pain wasn't exclusive. That suffering finds many faces and kindness does too. A few weeks later, I came to her house crying. It wasn't the first time Osto had gotten violent again, but it was the first time I couldn't keep it in anymore. Jeanette didn't say a word. She wrapped me in a blanket, made tea, sat beside me while I wept until there were no tears left. When I could finally speak, all I said was, "I can't do this anymore." She didn't say, "It'll be okay." She didn't say, "You'll get over it." She just nodded and said, "You don't have to do it alone." The next morning, she gave me the number of a local shelter. A place for girls like me. She said she knew someone there. She could help make the call, only if I wanted. I didn't make the call that day. But the card didn't leave my pocket for weeks. Because now I had something new, a choice. Jeanette never pushed me to leave. She never judged when I stayed. She simply reminded me, over and over, in 1,000 small ways, that there was life beyond that house. That not everyone would hurt me. That not everyone would look away. And that was what saved me. Because here's the truth, dear listener. You don't always need someone to fix everything. Sometimes you just need one person to believe you. One person to sit beside you in the silence and say, "I see you. I believe you. You matter." That's the power of one ally. And I owe Jeanette more than she'll ever know. Her quiet bravery gave me the courage to start imagining another life. One with safety, maybe even love. But before I could build that new life, I had to face the very thing that had haunted me most. The men behind the door. The ones who paid. The ones who kept coming. The ones whose faces I never forgot. And in the next part of my story, I'll tell you what I did with the names I remembered. People often imagine monsters wearing masks. But the truth is they wear suits. They wear wedding rings. They smell like aftershave and drive nice cars. They pat their sons on the back at Sunday barbecues, sit in church pews with clean collars, and smile for newspaper photos. They were the men who paid. And I remember their faces. Not all of them. Trauma does strange things to memory. Some names blurred, some faces lost in the fog of fear. But others stayed etched in the back of my mind like carvings on stone. The man with the gold watch who always wore gloves. The school principal who told me I was mature for my age. The car salesman who smelled of cigarettes and mint. The doctor who told me not to speak a word or he'd stop treating my father's heart condition. They didn't shout. They didn't beat. But they violated just the same. I was 16. I should have been worrying about geometry, not how to survive another visit. The first time it happened, I remember staring at the ceiling, trying to count the cracks in the plaster. 1, 2, 3. Anything to not look at him. When it was over, I walked back home and Mama asked why I looked pale. I said I felt dizzy. She gave me ginger tea and went back to sewing. The men always came quietly, always left quietly. No windows broken. No evidence left behind. And yet, they destroyed me just the same. What made it worse wasn't just what they did, it was who they were. Men respected in the community. Men people waved to on the street. Men whose wives brought casseroles to church fundraisers. Men who smiled at little girls in the park and no one thought twice. That was the true horror. Not the acts, but the system. The silence. The complicity. The fact that a network of money, reputation, and power could keep girls like me invisible. And I was just one. There were others I would come to learn. Other girls from poor neighborhoods, broken homes. Girls without protectors. Girls no one missed when they disappeared for a few hours. We were currency in a backroom economy no one dared talk about. Jeanette once said to me, "Simone, the world is run by men who write the rules and break them behind locked doors." I didn't fully understand what she meant until I started keeping track. After one particularly violent night, something shifted inside me. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was clarity. So I started remembering. Faces. Routines. times. Car plates. I found a notebook hidden beneath Maristella's old clothes in the closet. It still smelled like lavender and dust. In it, I began to write. Not full names when I didn't have them, but details. Green Buick, Tuesday nights, 8:30 p.m. Wife is nurse at clinic. He always wears brown leather gloves. Smells like whiskey. Asks for silence. At first, it was just for me, a way to make sense of it. But over time, it became a kind of armor. A ledger. A quiet threat to a system that believed I was too broken to remember anything. And I did remember. Because survivors do remember. Not in neat, linear ways. But in colors. In smells. In fragments sharp enough to cut. That notebook became my first act of rebellion. Because I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a witness. And being a witness meant I had power. Even if it was just scribbled in blue ink on lined paper. Years later, when I finally found the courage to share that notebook, it became evidence. It cracked open cases. It shook reputations. It made local headlines. Small town scandal, respected leaders implicated in abuse ring. But that would come later. For now I kept writing. And with every page, I took back something that had been stolen from me. My voice. I wish I could say justice came quickly. But justice is a slow, limping thing. Especially when it has to climb over money and status to get through the door. Some men denied everything. Others threatened me. One offered money to stay quiet. But I didn't want their money. I wanted truth. And I wanted freedom. There's a lesson here if you're still listening. Not all monsters hide in the woods. Some wear polished shoes. Some write city ordinances. Some hand out candy at school fairs. But they are not untouchable. And you? If you've been hurt, if you're still hurting. Let me tell you something I wish someone had told me. You are not powerless. Even if you're scared. Even if your voice shakes. Even if you're the only one speaking. You have more strength than they ever imagined. And sometimes that strength begins with a pen. Or whisper. Or a page torn from a notebook and kept close to your heart. I didn't know it then, but that little act, recording what they wanted me to forget, would become the key to everything that came next. Because to take your life back, you don't have to be loud. You just have to begin. And begin I did. In the next part of my story, I'll tell you what I did with that notebook. And how it became more than pages. It became power. It was just a notebook. Old. Worn. The kind you find buried beneath math homework or grocery lists. But mine was different. Inside its creased, faded pages were memories. Not the soft kind with warm light and laughter. But jagged memories. Etched in ink the color of midnight. This was my ledger. Not of numbers, but of names. Not of debts, but of wounds. And it started saving me long before it saved anyone else. At first, I kept it hidden. Tucked between the floorboards under my bed or slipped beneath the lining of an old shoebox. Each time I wrote something new. A plate number. A nickname. A smell. A date. I felt a strange flicker of control. In a world where I had none, this small ritual gave me purpose. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I only knew I needed to remember. Because forgetting meant they won. Years passed. Some of the men moved away. Some rose in prominence on city councils, school boards, even church leadership. I stayed silent. But my notebook didn't. It kept growing, like a quiet fire beneath cold ashes. Then one day something changed. I was 23. Volunteering at the women's house, mostly helping with literacy classes. One evening, while cleaning the storage cabinet, I found a box labeled Survivor Narratives, Anonymous. I opened it and read one. It was from a girl named R. She was 15 when her stepfather's boss started visiting their home. The details were painfully familiar. The promises. The threats. The smell of beer. The way her mother told her to be polite. I froze. Not because the story was shocking, but because I recognized the man. He was in my notebook. And so were others. Too many. I went home, pulled out my ledger, and compared. Out of 25 entries in my notebook, at least 7 matched stories from other girls and women. It wasn't just my past anymore. It was a pattern. A network. A system. I told Jeanette. She sat with her cup of tea silent, flipping through my notes as if holding sacred scripture. Then she said the words that cracked everything open. You're not just a survivor, Simone. You're a witness. And witnesses have power. But fear doesn't vanish overnight. What if they came after me? What if no one believed me again? What if this ruined everything I'd worked so hard to rebuild? Jeanette reached across the table, took my hand, and said, maybe. But what if it saves someone else? That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought of Maristella, of the girl I once was, of the other girls who still had no name, no voice, no protection. And by dawn I knew. It was time. We started small. Jeanette connected me with a journalist from a progressive local paper, a woman named Teresa Brown, known for her quiet, careful investigations into things no one wanted to talk about. I didn't give her the ledger immediately. First, I told her my story. Then I showed her a few pages. She listened without interruption, without flinching. After I finished, she looked at me with eyes full of fire and said, "We're going to do this. But we'll do it right." Together, we mapped out a plan. No sensationalism. No rushed headlines. Instead, facts, timelines, cross-referencing stories from different survivors. And protection, both legal and emotional, for the women who agreed to speak. Over the course of 6 months, Teresa built the case. She tracked down women who had never spoken, verified identities, cross-checked my notebook against public records. When the story finally broke, it didn't explode like a bomb. It crept in like a cold wind under the town's door. Behind closed doors, power, silence, and the women who remember. Front page. 8 names. 3 schools. 2 businesses. 1 church. And dozens of victims who could no longer be ignored. The backlash came swiftly. Angry letters to the editor. Threats. Whispers that I was making it up for attention. But something else happened too. Women started coming forward. One by one. Then dozens. Many had never told anyone. But seeing their own pain reflected in print cracked something open. The Women's House opened a special intake line. A legal aid fund was created. A city council hearing was scheduled. 3 men resigned from public office. 2 were formally charged. And my ledger? It became evidence. The district attorney called it one of the most meticulous personal records ever submitted in a sexual abuse investigation. But for me, it was never about headlines or handcuffs. It was about dignity. About saying, "This happened. I didn't imagine it. And I am not the only one." There's a lesson I carry from those days. It's this. Silence protects the powerful. But the truth? The truth protects the rest of us. And sometimes truth begins in secret. In a notebook. On a napkin. In a whispered conversation in the back room of a support group. You don't have to shout to start a revolution. You just have to write it down. Because every word is a crack in the wall of silence. Every name is a key. Every memory is a match. And eventually the fire will come. In the next part of my story, I'll introduce you to someone I met during that fire. Someone who, without ever asking for praise or credit, became the reason I made it through. A quiet woman named Laura. A lawyer, a fighter, and the ally who reminded me that justice isn't a miracle. It's a decision. People often imagine heroes bursting through doors, voices raised, capes billowing behind them. But some heroes wear flats and carry file folders. And they speak softly. So softly, in fact, that their strength is almost invisible. Until you realize they were the ones holding your world together all along. That was Laura. I met her on a Tuesday. It had been a few weeks since Teresa's article broke the silence over Riverside. The Women's House had become a kind of ground zero, Women flooding in with stories, questions, shame, and trembling hope. We were overwhelmed emotionally, legally, and logistically. That afternoon, I was in the office trying to help a mother of 3 who feared her abusive husband might show up at the school. I was flustered, angry, and completely unsure of what I was doing. Then she walked in. A tall woman, no more than 35, with clear brown eyes and an energy that radiated calm. "I'm Laura Mitchell," she said, reaching out her hand. "I'm a legal aid attorney. I read about your work, and I want to help." Just like that. No grand speech. No self-congratulations. Just a simple offer from someone who had already rolled up her sleeves before stepping through the door. I didn't realize it then, but that was the moment the next chapter of my life quietly began. Laura was different. Where I was fire, she was water. Where I was impulsive, she was methodical. Where I told stories with trembling voice and tears, she built cases with legal codes and case precedents. We became partners in a war we never planned to fight. She took on the toughest cases first. Women whose abusers were cops, pastors, businessmen. She would sit across from a survivor, notebook in hand, and listen. Really listen. Not rushing. Not judging, just present. And then she would build. Like a quiet architect of justice, she'd draw the legal paths that survivors could walk on without falling through the cracks. One case stands out. A 17-year-old named Carla came in one evening, barely able to look us in the eye. She had escaped from a trafficking ring operating out of a mechanic shop owned by a man who coached the local Little League. No one believed her. Until Laura did. Laura didn't flinch when Carla showed her the scars. She didn't speak over her. She didn't offer pity. She just said, "We'll start with a restraining order. And then we build from there." She stayed in court with Carla every step of the way. She fought for police protection, housing, counseling. And when Carla testified, shaking from head to toe, Laura stood behind her. Not in front, not beside, behind. A quiet presence. A shadow of strength. It taught me something. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply stand behind them and let them know they're not alone. Laura and I became more than co-workers. We became sisters in arms. Not through blood, but through shared purpose. Late at night, over leftover coffee and the humming of the copy machine, we'd talk. About justice. About fatigue. About how to keep going when every story broke your heart a little more. "Don't carry it all, Simone," she said once, handing me a folder with evidence photos. "You're allowed to lay some of it down. That's why we have each other." I didn't know how much I needed that until she said it. If there's one lesson Laura taught me, it's this. One ally can change everything. Not by fixing your life. Not by rescuing you with fanfare. But by walking in, sitting down, and saying, "Let's figure this out together." Too many survivors never get that. Too many drown alone. But because of Laura, dozens of women in Riverside found their way to safety. Not just physically, but legally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I learned that my fight didn't have to be lonely. I learned that healing isn't just about rising. It's also about reaching. And being reached for. In time, Laura and I co-founded the legal advocacy wing of the Women's House. It wasn't much: a shared desk, a fax machine, a binder of state codes held together with duct tape. But it was enough. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Signs a form. Files a motion. Shows up. Laura showed up. And in doing so, she reminded me that courage is contagious. In the next part of my story, I'll tell you about what happened when I finally dared to imagine a life beyond survival. A life with love, with home, with new beginnings. Because healing is not just an ending. Sometimes it's a whole new story. And mine was just beginning. If you had asked me in my 20s what love looked like, I probably would have pointed to silence, survival. Or maybe even an old notebook filled with pain. But healing, as I later discovered, is a curious thing. It doesn't rush. It doesn't shout. It tiptoes in quietly. Like the scent of a cake baking in the next room, faint but comforting. And that's how love found me again. Not with roses. Not with declarations. But with the simple kindness of a man named Carlos. I met Carlos in 1983. He was a sociology professor helping us with a joint workshop on domestic violence and systemic power. We were both speaking, me from lived experience, him from research. He wore corduroy jackets, spoke slowly, and always carried a pin tucked behind one ear. At first, I kept my distance. Trust didn't come easy, especially not with men. But Carlos was different. He never interrupted. He never tried to fix me. He just listened, with eyes that didn't scan for weakness, only for understanding. One rainy evening after a long seminar, we found ourselves alone in the empty classroom. He asked if I wanted to get dinner. My instinct was to decline. But I looked out the window at the rain falling in steady sheets, and for some reason I said yes. That dinner turned into a weekly ritual. Then into Sunday walks at Fairmount Park. Then into quiet conversations about books, trauma, and things we both feared naming. He never touched me without asking. He never pushed for stories I didn't want to share. He never assumed he had a right to anything just because he stayed. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt safe next to someone. Healing isn't linear. There were nights I couldn't sleep. Waking up from old nightmares with tears I couldn't explain. Carlos never asked me to stop crying. He'd just make chamomile tea and sit beside me. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes reading from whatever book was on the nightstand. Once I asked him, "Don't you wish I were easier to love?" He looked up, smiled softly, and said, "You are easy to love. Life just made it harder for you to believe it." That was the moment I realized. Love isn't the absence of fear. It's the gentle hand that holds yours through the fear. In 1985, after 2 years of walking this cautious path together, we moved into a small home with a garden. It wasn't perfect. I still had days where the past clung like wet clothes. But it was ours. We grew tomatoes and daisies. Adopted a stray cat named Oliver who liked to sit on Carlos's papers. We even painted the front door bright red, as if daring the world to see joy blooming where pain once lived. We never had children. Not because we didn't want to love, but because we had already started loving in different ways. We mentored students, helped young women escape abusive households, built community programs that taught teenagers how to recognize control, coercion, and consent. We built a family not of blood, but of choice. And every name, every life touched, was part of our home. There's a lesson in all of this. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means making space for something else to grow alongside the scars. For years I thought survival meant locking all the doors in my heart. But Carlos showed me that it's okay to open one. Just one. And let the light in. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough. When I look back now, I realize that reclaiming my life didn't happen on one big triumphant day. It happened slowly. In every laugh shared over burnt toast. In every night I went to sleep without fear. In every sunrise where I didn't feel alone anymore. In the next chapter, I'll tell you about a letter. Just one letter. That arrived in the mail one ordinary afternoon. A letter that carried a name I hadn't spoken in decades. And gave me back a piece of myself I thought was lost forever. Because healing isn't just about moving forward. Sometimes it's about circling back. To close a door. To open another. Or simply to say goodbye. It came on a Wednesday. I was sorting through the mail like I always did it. Bills, catalogs, a coupon for a new diner on Magnolia Street. When I saw it. A plain envelope. No return address. My name handwritten in neat cursive. The kind they used to teach in schools back when handwriting was still a form of character. Something about it made me pause. It wasn't the envelope itself. It was the feeling. That quiet tug behind the ribs, like a memory waking up. I opened it slowly, carefully, as if the paper might crumble from too much pressure. Inside, just one page. Folded 3 times. The words were simple. My name is Julia. I believe you might be my mother. I read that line 5 times before my brain caught up with my eyes. My heart didn't race. It stilled. As if the world had taken a long, collective breath. Julia. A name I hadn't said aloud in nearly 40 years. You see, one of the many things trauma stole from me was motherhood. Between the ages of 16 and 25, I had 10 pregnancies. Most ended before I could even feel movement. 2 came into the world and were taken from me immediately, placed in the arms of strangers by people who thought they were helping. At the time, I was too broken to protest. Too ashamed. Too unsure of what love meant when every part of me felt like it was covered in shame and silence. But I never forgot the names I whispered into the night. One of them was Julia. The letter continued. I was adopted in 1969. My adoptive parents were kind. They told me what they knew when I turned 21, that I was born in Riverside. That my birth mother was young. And that she didn't have a choice. There was no bitterness in her tone. Just curiosity. Hope even. She wrote of being a teacher. Of loving books and journaling. Of never quite knowing why she cried when she saw mothers hold their daughters' hands in grocery stores. And then she wrote, I don't want to intrude. But I would love to meet you if you're willing. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time. Carlos came into the room, saw the look on my face, and didn't ask anything right away. He just poured me a glass of water and waited. When I finally told him, his only words were, Then let's meet her. Not you should. Not do you want to? Just, let's. As if this was our story now. Not just mine. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, halfway between Riverside and her town. I arrived early, hands trembling under the table. The waitress brought me chamomile tea without asking. I must have looked like someone who needed calming. And then she walked in. Brown eyes. Long fingers. A nervous smile that broke into something so achingly familiar. I had to look away for a moment. She sat across from me and said softly, Hi, Simone. Not Mom. Not Mother. Just my name. And it was perfect. We talked for hours. About childhood. About teaching. About healing from things we never chose but had to carry. She told me she'd spent years wondering if she was unwanted. If she was born from something bad. And I looked her in the eyes and said, You were born from something painful. But you were never a mistake. You were my light when the world went dark. We cried. We laughed. We shared photos. She asked if I liked lemon cake. I said, only if it's dry and overly sweet, like my childhood birthdays. She smiled. Mine too. There's a truth I want to share with you now, dear listener. Closure doesn't always come with clean endings or perfect resolutions. Sometimes it's just a name returned to your hands. A piece of yourself brought back by grace. A bit of peace that arrives in a plain white envelope. Meeting Julia didn't undo the years. It didn't magically fill the empty chair at holiday dinners or erase the pain of what I lost. But it gave me something just as powerful. Connection. Recognition. A sense that perhaps in some quiet corner of the universe, healing had been taking root even when I wasn't looking. She now calls me Simone still. Sometimes Ma when we're joking. We don't force anything. We let the relationship bloom like a wildflower. Free, imperfect, beautiful. And in those quiet moments, when she calls to ask what seasoning works best with roasted carrots, or when she sends a photo of her classroom full of books and scribbles, I feel something deep and still and sacred. I feel whole. In the next chapter, I'll share what it means to grow old with strength. Not in years, but in legacy. Because a life like this, broken, rebuilt, reimagined, deserves to be passed on. It deserves to be planted, watered, and told again. And that, my dears, is where we'll end. In a garden of red geraniums, where the past rests softly in the soil, and new stories reach toward the sun. There's something magical about mornings in my garden. The air is still. The birds haven't decided on their songs yet. And the soil damp with dew feels like a promise. Not loud or showy, but steady and full of quiet hope. I like to start my day with my hands in the earth. At 73, my knees don't always cooperate. And my back complains more than it used to. But planting, pruning, watering. These rituals remind me I'm still here. Still alive. Still creating. People often imagine redemption as a grand finale. Trumpets. Speeches. Some moment of standing on a mountaintop with your fists raised to the sky. But real redemption? It's quieter than that. It's a cup of tea with someone you love. It's the slow way your body relaxes when you no longer expect to be hurt. It's laughter you didn't think you were still capable of. It's a garden blooming in a backyard once filled with silence. After Carlos passed, I spent weeks talking to the plants. Tomatoes. Lavender. Red geraniums that always reminded me of the ones Maristella loved. There was something healing in knowing the soil would still respond to care. Even when my heart was heavy, each bloom felt like a whisper from those I had lost. Austere, perhaps, but kind. I didn't need to fill the house with people. I filled it with meaning. The women's house is still running. We now have 5 branches across California. We've supported thousands of survivors. Women, girls, and even boys who needed a place to begin again. Every time I step into one of those buildings, I see not just bricks and offices, but a timeline of healing. There's a mural in a Riverside office. It shows a tree massive, colorful, its roots deep in the ground. And in the roots, if you look closely, are the names of women who helped build it. My name is there. So is Laura's. So is Maristella's. Because redemption, my dear, is not just what you do for yourself, but what you build for others. I've seen many young women come through our doors over the decades. Some walk in holding children on their hips. Some come alone, carrying bruises that don't always show on skin. Some can't look us in the eyes yet. And that's okay, because I remember when I couldn't either. I often tell them something I learned late in life. You're allowed to start over. Even if it's your 10th time. Even if the world says you don't deserve it. Especially then. That sentence alone, said softly in a kitchen or hallway, can break open a heart sealed shut by fear. Julia visits often now. She brings lemon cake and books. Sometimes she stays the weekend and we cook together. She teases me for my old-fashioned radio and my obsession with crossword puzzles. And sometimes we just sit in silence. 2 women, once separated by time and pain, now finding comfort in the same sunset. She asked me once, "Do you wish things had happened differently?" I thought about it. The truth is, I wish the pain never happened. I wish Maristella lived to grow old. I wish I had never learned the taste of fear so young. But I also know, without that pain, I would never have become this version of me. The one who listens, who writes, who teaches, Who plants? So my answer was simple. I wish it didn't happen. But I'm proud of who I became anyway. You see, redemption is not erasing the past. It's turning the soil of it, finding what still holds life, and planting something beautiful. It's not pretending the wound never existed. It's wearing the scar with grace. If you're listening to this and wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, you will. Not in a perfect, untouched way, but in the way flowers grow through sidewalk cracks. Persistent, defiant, glorious. You don't need a garden to heal. You just need one thing worth tending. A story, a purpose, a name you say with love. Thank you, my dears, for walking this journey with me. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what seed you're planting today. Because this channel, this space we share, isn't just about the past. It's about what we grow together next. And if no one has told you today, you are not your trauma. You are not your worst day. You are not what they did to you. You are a garden waiting for spring. So take a breath, pour some tea, step into the light, and begin again.